All right. Hi, everybody. I think we are ready to get started with today's webinar. Let me get to the right screen here. All right, so thank you for joining us today. My name is Yvonne Castillo, Director of Risk Management at Victor US. Thank you for joining us today. So today's program, Peek Behind the Curtain, Federal Stimulus and Project Development has been approved for credit through the AIA as a live presentation. Here's the official course number for reference. We are going to be recording today, or we are recording today. So if you want to go back and watch the webinar, it will be on our website. But just keep in mind that the 1 hour of credit is only available for today's live program. And just quick logistical issue. So if you would like continuing education credit, after the webinar, you're going to receive a survey link from us. And if you are a Victor CNA policyholder and you are also an AIA member, we'll report for you to the AIA your completion of this program. But just please let us know in that survey link that you provided your AIA number, and we'll report it on your behalf. If you are a Victor CNA policyholder, but you are not an AIA member, but you want a certificate of completion or participation, again, just let us know in the survey link and we will get you those certificates. So let's move on to our program today. So our agenda today is really to help you connect the dots between a profusion of federal relief packages related to infrastructure, project development, and business opportunities for you, especially for design firms. I'm really excited that you're going to be with us today because my hope is that you're going to walk away with some real concrete steps on how to optimize all of this federal stimulus money. So we're going to start first with just kind of a 30,000 foot perspective. What has happened so far since the pandemic? What legislation has passed? What new laws do we have? What do those stimulus packages look like? What are they called? How are they different? How are they similar? What are their policy priorities? So we'll kind of give you just a general timeline first, just to kind of lay some foundation on what we're going to be talking about. Then we're going to move in quickly with our guest, who's going to provide you with some insight on kind of the frame of mind that lawmakers are in at the state and local level, given what they've gone through over the pandemic. What are their challenges? What are their public policy priorities? And how are they viewing the federal funding that's coming down to them? So then we'll pivot and we'll look at the American Rescue Plan Act. You've heard of this, called the ARPA. So that was passed in March of last year. We'll talk about that in a second, but we're going to talk about key provisions, some policy priorities, what that general timeline is for you, and what eligible project matches there are. Then we're going to pivot over to the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. This is also known as the Bipartisan Infrastructure Bill. This is what everybody's talking about. Again, we're going to talk about what those key provisions are, policy priorities, project timelines, and then give you a sense of specifically what you need to be looking for to take advantage of those opportunities. And then lastly, we want you to know what may be also coming down the pike, the Build Back Better Act, which has not yet passed. We'll talk about what's going on with that bill and what we expect or hope to expect in the coming future, and what it could mean for you and for business and for climate. Okay, so we have invited a guest. Her name is Liz Farmer. Unfortunately, she is having technical difficulties and is not able to join via webcam. So apologize for that, but she is with us and I'm super excited. She is a fiscal policy expert, nationally recognized journalist, and she covers all the ways that state and local governments spend our taxpayer money. She authors the weekly newsletter called Long Story Short. She is also a regular contributor to Forbes and Route 50, and she is a research fellow at the Rockefeller Institute of Government's Future of Work Research Center. So in addition to writing, Liz is also a consultant with a group called Funkhauser and Associates. They are a team of consultants that have deep government insider experience. We've worked with them in the past. Actually, they're going to be joining us for our annual meeting in May. So really love working with this group of folks. If you'd like to subscribe to Liz's newsletter, I will put here a QR code. So just point your phone camera at the QR code and you can subscribe to her newsletter. If you want to connect with her on LinkedIn, same thing, just point your phone camera at the screen here and you can connect with her on LinkedIn. Okay, so as promised, let's start with just a 30,000 foot perspective, the biggest picture of all. What has happened over the last couple of years? And this is where I'm going to turn it over to Liz. She's going to walk us through just a general timeline. We're not going to necessarily get into the weeds here. Just want to get us an understanding of where we are, all of the packages that have passed so far. I can hear you, Liz. Hi. Can you hear
Hi. Yes, I can.
Great.
Thanks for having me.
Yes, glad to have you. So Liz, I can click through however you want. Go ahead, and if you want to start with the CARES Act and just kind of give our audience members just a general view of where are we right now, what key dates are coming up. I can click through as you indicate.
Sounds wonderful. And sorry again about these technical issues. I have no idea what is going on, but at least I don't have to look at my face for the whole hour. There is a lot to get through, so let's get started. So this is just a broad overview of the timeline, and we had CARES Act right at the beginning of the pandemic in March 2020, and that was a several $100 billion bill, but it sent about $150 billion directly to large governments in the United States, and that's, they didn't have to jump through any hoops. They literally just saw the money show up in the government bank account. That was followed again in late 2020 by what's called the Consolidated Appropriations Act. That was a spending bill, but it also included almost $1 billion in additional COVID relief. Both the CARES Act and this Appropriations Act, the 2020 measures were very largely responsive. They were to help people pay rent, to help governments get through revenue shortfalls. It was emergency spending measures, so money in, money out, spent. It's not really an investment. 2021 is where we start to see that change. The American Rescue Plan Act was passed in March of 2021. That was about it was the biggest spending bill yet, about 1.9 trillion, and that included it included another round of checks of economic impact payment stimulus checks to households. That was a large chunk of it. For governments, they got even more money, more direct money than they did via the CARES Act, in that deposit in their government bank accounts. This time, Congress approved about $360 billion in spending, and that was to every local government entity in the United States. So not just large governments, large cities of 500,000 people or more, but small towns like the one I live in Smithsburg, Maryland, population 3,000. And so that was a huge deal. We've never really seen anything like this before in terms of a direct payment from the federal government to localities everywhere, particularly small localities. And that's why a lot of governments are both excited and overwhelmed with what to do with this, what is a windfall for a lot of them. That was followed in November by the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. That was another approximately $1 trillion in spending, but some of that was just reauthorizing spending that had been approved, in previous iterations. About $550 billion of that bill was new spending, either increases in funding existing programs or creating new programs, and we'll get into the details of what all that means a little bit later. And so again, huge deal for governments. You know, as you can see, 2021 was a big year in terms of the money available to states and localities, the federal support for them to invest in big programs. And this followed an era of, you know, about a decade of austerity from the federal government, withdrawing or keeping spending flat. So you add that into the mix here, and it's again understandable why governments are a little flat-footed in terms of how to best take advantage of these opportunities. And that last dot on the timeline, of course, is the pending Build Back Better Act. It was passed late last year in House. It's pending before the Senate, of course, and debates go on about that. I think currently it's valued at about 1.7 trillion in spending, but it's not likely to ultimately represent that much money, in spending. And this is, of course, not, it's billed as the climate bill, which it very much is, but it also addresses health issues, social issues. It's really the environment and social spending bill. So that's a lot of money. And Yvonne, you want to take us to the next slide?
Yeah, and I thought it would be important. Thank you, Liz. That's great. Just to get us started, I think it's really important that we understand the history that is being made here. I found a picture of Roosevelt, and just because, you know, it's just so momentous. The general timeline that you've laid out, the amounts of spending, they're really being compared to back when, you know, in 1933, when President Roosevelt was trying to revive an economy, trying to inject federal funding into public works projects, new programs. It's really, we are in a moment that is truly a once in a generation moment. None of us on this call will ever experience this level of federal stimulus. And it's just important to kind of note that as we go along here. You know, I think one thing I wanted to share, you alluded to this already, Liz, but you and I were talking before this and sort of trying to figure out, okay, how does the level of stimulus that could happen, even, you know, if we have a Build Back Better Act in the next few months, you know, even assuming half, we are literally at the same, when in today's dollars, we are really looking at a sort of rivaling that same level of spending. So it's just really important for design firms who are on this call today to recognize that, and also to recognize that we're not talking about the Obama administration shovel-ready projects. We're talking about projects that need planning, need design services. So it's just an incredible moment for our clients to engage. So I'm going to turn it over, Liz, unless you want to flesh that out, but I'll turn it over to you on the next slide to kind of start digging into what that stimulus funding looks like.
Yeah, let's definitely get started on that, because we'll touch on those themes as we get through this. So we're first going to dive into the American Rescue Plan Act. And again, as I mentioned, it contained about $360 billion in direct funding, just money, checks, blank checks almost, to governments. And it was divided. This chart here is just kind of showing you how that breaks down. Again, as I mentioned, it went to every local government in the country, no matter how big or small. So this sort of just shows how, you know, states got a set amount, DC got a set amount, tribes got about 20 billion across there. And ARPA was kind of, other than the state level, for local governments, the amount that local governments got, it did depend on how large they are. So that population did come into play, obviously, in that sense. And there was a cap, like local governments can't receive more than what they actually spend in a fiscal year. But largely, like I'll take, for example, my town again, because I'm pretty familiar with it, and it's a good example of, you know, a small town that's seeing a lot of money. You know, my town spends about $3.5 million a year on its budget. It's getting a total of about $2 million over the course of 2 years in American Rescue Plan funds. So, I mean, that's a huge amount of money, and with it comes this big sense of responsibility. And so there are rules for how to spend it. Of course, it's not a blank check like I joked, and that's what those bullet points kind of outline here. There are rules, but to a large degree, government there's a good amount of flexibility. As you can see, eligible uses include anything from affordable housing, parks, mobility, bike lanes, expanding bike lanes, expanding hospitals or healthcare facilities. There are, of course, other things, but I tried to focus here on the types of projects that this audience would be interested in. Expanding school facilities, streetscapes, and then the important themes connecting all of this stuff, the things that governments are going to need to be doing with these projects in order for it to fall under the rule, in order for it to be an eligible use and therefore okay with the federal government when they come back and audit all of this spending. Those themes are equity, climate friendly, the use of technology, particularly in the sense of using technology for evidence-based policy. Public-private partnerships is mentioned a few times in the ARPA, in the American Rescue Plan Act, and also in the rules for the spending of these particular funds. And in addition to that, forward-looking investments. And by that, I mean, kind of ties back in with climate-friendly projects with equity, investments that are targeted towards the groups that were disadvantaged before the pandemic and who really, really, saw a lot of harm, either health-wise or money-wise because of the pandemic. And that largely means, folks who are low income, people of color, and people with pre-existing health conditions. A lot of these folks, older Americans, saw a lot of negative impacts during the pandemic. So investments geared towards these types of populations, affordable housing, mixed-use dwelling units, that kind of thing, that helps give these particular populations as a more stable existence, period. Those are the kinds of things that the U.S. government, that the Treasury Department really would love to see governments looking at with these funds.
And then we can move on to again, we're keeping it high level at this point. We're just kind of giving an overview. We're going to dig a little deeper, but Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, do you want to walk us through some of that?
Yeah, we've got two slides here. The first slide is, as I mentioned earlier, there's $550 billion in new spending with the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. And this is just a bar chart that I pulled from the National Association of Counties. It's a good visual for how that money really breaks down. As you can see, about half of that new spending is going to be from the department, or for the Department of Transportation. And then water investments and broadband and power and energy related spending is also kind of the next big chunk of it. Resiliency is another part of it, and that kind of falls under sort of any category you can think of when it comes to climate friendly projects. But this is just a good kind of, if you're wondering where a lot of this money is going to be, it's going to be coming from the Department of Transportation. And so the next slide kind of shows, okay, it breaks it down a little bit further. So this is all that new money that's going to the Department of Transportation. And again, there is a big chunk already claimed, and that's for roads and bridges, but that also includes mobility projects, design, planning, that kind of thing. And then the rest is sort of, and rail, of course, is a big chunk of it. But then the rest of this is a lot of stuff that applies to state and local governments, ports and waterways, airports. I think a particular note is safety-related projects and transit. And then those two at the top, and then towards the bottom, you'll see something called reconnecting communities. I'll get into that a little bit more later, but those are our types of projects and investments that you're going to see a lot of activity, particularly at the local level.
Thanks, Liz. And then I also, again, before we dig in too deep, I just wanted our audience to understand, at a high level again, what is the difference between ARPA and IIJA? Are there different policy priority objectives. I mean, you've already kind of gone through some of the funding levels, but you want to touch on that for a second?
Yeah, absolutely. So there are similarities between ARPA and IIJA, and you could also, when you're starting to look at Build Back Better, I would bet big money on all of these similarities, these themes also being in Build Back Better and being high priorities. So you know, as I mentioned before, equity, environment, technology, particularly using that to track outcomes of a project, so that you can show that, you know, there's evidence for your project working, and data ties into that. All of those things are mentioned a ton of times, not just in the American Rescue Plan, in the Infrastructure and Jobs Act. And this graphic I have here is one program that we know a little bit more about because they just released the rules for this one. I did a word cloud. I did a word count of the top words in the rules for this particular competitive grant program. And as you can see, again, it's equity, tech, environment, innovate. You know, and so I would expect these types of priorities to be pretty much across all of the upcoming competitive grant type projects. There are differences though. Funding structure, like I mentioned before, ARPA was just money that went straight to governments. There are rules for how to spend them, but they don't have to do anything special to get the money. Grants and formula funding, which I think we're going to get into a little bit more later, those are the funding. That's how the Infrastructure and Jobs Act is coming. So either governments have to wait to get the money, or it's a competitive grant that they have to then apply for. And again, that's really where this audience can be of great help. Timing, ARPA funds, some of it has already come out. The rest of it's going to be coming out soon. IIJA is more of a slow release. And then the rules. ARPA funding, that direct money is, as I mentioned before, pretty flexible. The Infrastructure and Jobs Act is a whole different beast in terms of that. It's going to have a lot more rules. There are, you know, lots of different programs that are going to have their own, you know, timelines and things like that. So it's a much more to keep track of.
Thanks, Liz. That's great. That's just give us some foundation of what we're looking at. And, you know, I think it's helpful to see these cues on, you know, the most frequently used words as firms think about their expertise, their strategic plans for the coming years. These are the things you have to be thinking about strategically to, you know, plan how you're going to drive your project pipeline, and is it involving these kinds of technologies, and considering climate mitigation, climate adaptation, and equity, affordable housing issues. So just quickly, I wanted to pause for a moment before we jump into ARPA and IIJA and how to access those funds. I thought it would be helpful for Liz, because she has such a good pulse on our state and local population, the people. Just kind of give us a frame of what is their frame of mind? What are they thinking about? What are the biggest challenges after 2 years of pandemic? What are they, how are they viewing the federal funding that's coming their way?
Yeah, we're increasingly getting questions about, how do I spend this money? How am I allowed to spend this money? You know, I don't want to get it wrong. What are the rules? So local governments in particular are very concerned about doing this right. And right can mean a lot of things depending on your capacity. Right for a small government might just mean, you know, spending it and not getting audited and not getting in trouble, not having to give the money back. For larger governments, it can mean, you know, we want to invest this money. We don't want to just spend it on something that, you know, takes care of 1 year. We want to invest it in something that's going to reap dividends for years to come. So, you know, depending on, you know, the size of government, the savviness to some degree of those in charge, that scope can be different, but everyone's worried about it on some level. You know, COVID brought everybody to the ringer. Obviously, But financially speaking for governments, there was a lot of worries and concern that this would just be even more devastating than what happened during the Great Recession. And Congress responded. And these, we talked about these Great Depression, New Deal type of spending packages, largely helped bring governments out of those fears. We've seen a lot of headlines about, states just don't know what to do with all this extra money. And that's true for some places, but I would caution against thinking that every government must just be doing fine and have money to burn, because that's certainly not the case, particularly at the city and county level. It's really varied. Chicago's still still has financial problems. So it's the financial climate is really dependent upon, goes from city to city. So, but the big concerns of, that are top of mind for a lot of particularly large metropolitan areas, climate change and resiliency goals. A lot of places had instituted, are marching towards their own climate and resiliency goals. And now they want to be able to take advantage of federal funding to further them. This and the social justice and equity, particularly over the last 2 years in the pandemic and with the Black Lives Matter movement, that was a big concern, a big issue and priority for mayors, wanting to kind of implement programs that get at systemic racism. And what that means in practical terms is, for example, looking at zoning codes and trying to go through massive rezoning efforts in a way that is much more equitable and much more fair. And so that's a big concern right now. And along with all of that goes the state of infrastructure, bridges and that sort of thing. And then the last really, really big concern to pile on here is staffing and capacity. For once, governments have enough money, but they now don't have enough people to do the stuff they want to do with that money. Just like what's happening in the private sector, governments are going through a great resignation of their own, particularly on the local level. And I'd say almost, like 90% of this is at the local government level. More people are either retiring or quitting at the local government level than ever before, and they just can't hire fast enough to replace them. And so pretty much everyone I talk to at a city or county level is really watching this trend and worried about how they're going to be able to effectively take advantage of this federal funding when they don't have the full staff and capacity that they thought that they would have.
Yeah, and we're going to talk about that for sure, because I think that's one of the key takeaways for all of you on this webinar is opportunity. This is an incredible opportunity for our design firm. So we'll be sensitive to time and go ahead and move into the American Rescue Plan Act. So this is just a slightly deeper dive now. We're going to take a close look at the timeline. So as Liz said, March last year, the law passed, and then there was an interim rule that passed to kind of set the guardrails for how the money might be spent, what the project eligibility criteria might be. And then just last month was the final rule. So definitive clarity around eligible project criteria. Liz, can you take us through so how is this money going to be spent? What are the deadlines for the ARPA money at this point? I'll click through for you.
Yeah. So that final rule granted more flexibility with the spending, and we can kind of get into that a little bit in one of the next slides. But so now federal governments have half of their ARPA funds. They are set to get their second tranche, their second deposit, the second half of their ARPA funds later this year. And then they have until December 31st, 2024 to actually figure out how they're going to spend that money and then, include that in their spending plan, AKA their budgets. So that basically means, if they're if they want to give the money to a nonprofit, they have to give that money to the nonprofit. If they want to use ARPA funds to, to invest in upgrading their water sewer system, the city council has to approve that. It has to be in the budget. That money doesn't actually have to be out the door per se, though. They just have to definitively say and go through all the, fund voting and all of that stuff to figure out exactly how they're going to spend that money. Fast forward to that last dot, they do have to spend it by 2 years after that point. So, but it's a really long timeline. Again, this is in contrast to the stuff that we saw early in the pandemic in 2020. That money was kind of in and out just very quickly. ARPA is different. It allows governments time to be able to figure out, what kind of big projects do they want to use this money for, and they have until the end of 2026 to wrap all of that up.
And do you want to talk about some of the project types that I know you touched on this already, but kind of building, sort of building that?
Yeah, so I just wanted to illustrate it. We're talking a lot about the recovery funding, that 300 and the 300. It says 350 there. If anyone sees different numbers on this, the reason is because 350 billion is what is going directly to governments, but there's another 10 billion in a capital projects fund. You'll see that in the purple box, but that's also considered, somewhat flexible money. So the numbers kind of differ depending on who you're talking to. So I just wanted to clear that up. But a lot of the money, the things that we'll be talking about and focusing on are this recovery fund spending. It goes towards supporting public health expenditures, replacing lost revenue. And those are kind of like those one-time things I'm talking about: personal protection equipment, helping fill a budget shortfall. But those other bullet points, addressing negative economic impacts, premium pay for essential workers, investing in infrastructure, including water, sewer, and broadband. Those are really broad categories that fall under the, the investment style of spending that can be done with this recovery funding. There are also other aspects of the American Rescue Plan that I just wanted to highlight briefly. It's not just all about those recovery funds. There's specific money for transportation and infrastructure. There's 40 billion plus for transit relief funding. There's that capital projects fund I mentioned. And then there's also stuff for health and home. Most of this stuff is one-time spending, though, which is why we're not focusing on it as much. That rental and homeowner assistance, utility assistance programs, those household stimulus checks. So there was a lot of, that's why ARPA was so big. But most of this kind of lasting stuff is going to be done with that 300, those recovery funds.
So hopefully you can see my screen, but do you want to talk about, okay.
Yeah, I'm working on this. Yeah, I'm actually thinking about adding there's the 3 E's I have here, and this is just a quick look at what is a project that falls under these priorities that the administration is outlining: equity, engagement, environment. I'm considering adding a 4th E of evidence, evidence-based projects. But this is just an example to kind of give you a visual, like what does something like this look like? What is a project that a government could do that would really be a good example, a good use of the ARPA funding? And so again, that box on the left is just the types of investment that you're going to want to watch out for, particularly affordable housing. Addressing equity gaps essentially means a project that helps people who have been typically underserved, whether it's they don't have access to broadband, they don't have access to affordable broadband, they don't have transit access, that kind of thing. And then looking over to the right, I wanted to just do a little highlight of slow streets. And this was something that cropped up in a lot of places during the pandemic. And this is, San Francisco's approach. Slow streets, as you can see, it closes not just a block, but a series of blocks on a particular road to through traffic, and lowers the speed limit of cars that are going through there to like 10, 15 miles an hour. And you can see down there in that map on the right, there's a purple line and a blue line that goes perpendicular to it. Those are 2 slow streets corridors in San Francisco during the pandemic. So you can see how these streets can start to create a network for anyone on foot or on wheels. And the idea behind this was to just give people more access to open space to roam and to give them more mobility options, so they didn't have to use public transit if they were afraid of riding the bus in the in particularly during the height of the pandemic. And they became really popular. They're so popular that a lot of places are looking at, well, how do we make some of these permanent? And that's what San Francisco is doing right now. And they're going through this huge planning and design process and engaging the community, getting feedback, looking at it to which streets should we keep to really kind of where are the communities that need them the most, which communities don't have as much, green space access or direct access to retail, that kind of thing. So that's that equity piece as well. And of course, the environment, if it discourages, use of cars to any degree, that's helpful. So Slow Streets is an example of something that kind of hits all of those key priorities of the administration when it comes to spending this money.
Thanks, Liz. Those are great examples. So let's move on to Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. Okay, so this is the law that everybody's talking about right now. Infrastructure Week finally came to pass in November of last year. We now have a comprehensive infrastructure investment package. Just a little bit of background on this really quick. This involves several months of negotiations. The actual start amount on the proposal was 2.3 trillion. I think they ended up at around 1.2 trillion when all was said and done and the law got signed. It was supported in a bipartisan manner. The American Council of Engineering Companies, supported it. The American Institute of Architects supported it. So before I turn this over to Liz, I wanted to kind of lay out a little bit of the goals. Similar to ARPA, same kind of tone. The president, the administration is talking about these funds being used for economic development, for equity and justice for lower income neighborhoods in recognition of those existing inequities, social inequities that were maybe worsened by the pandemic. Climate and resilience, of course, big focus. A made in America, US-based manufacturing revival. A lot of that going on, especially as it relates to topics that we all care about, steel and cement in our industry. So we're going to see more of that, and a focus on creating good paying jobs. Lastly, or one more thing I wanted to touch on, Liz has already touched on this, but the types of funding, there's two forms of funding for the IIJA. There's the non-competitive, which requires no action by states. It's automatically given to states based on population and need. And then, as Liz said, the competitive grant piece here, this does require application by state and local governments, but this is where design firms have such a key role to play. And we're going to talk about that in a second, but before I turn this over to Liz, I also wanted to give you kind of a framework of the structure that how this money is going to kind of roll down from federal, state to local. So first of all, there is a strong recognition by this administration that what they are doing with all of the stimulus money in terms of the size of funds and programs is really extraordinary, historic. They're calling it a shared endeavor in recognition that there is going to have to be so much coordination and collaboration between federal officials down to state and local officials that they had to create some sort of structure around all of this. They're not just throwing the money downstream and saying, have at it. So I tried to create a bit of a structure here to show you, or a graphic to show you how that structure is flowing. So first of all, they created a White House implementation, or they appointed a White House implementation coordinator. This is the former mayor of New Orleans, Mitch Landrieu. And then below that, the same day that this law was passed in November, they created what they call a task force. And this involves key federal agency cabinet members. So I put that over here. So the agencies that are have the most at stake in this law and the most funding. Then parallel to that, you can see over here the federal infrastructure implementation coordinators. The reason this is important is what they're doing is they're creating an executive task force, and then where the rubber meets the road, having federal appointed designees at each federal agency to kind of manage those flows of funds downward. So they have what they call implementation coordinators, and then below them on January 4th, so just early part of this year, the White House implementation coordinator sent a letter to all the governors, the state governors, and said, we recommend you do something similar to what we've done at the federal level and appoint one person in your state to be the infrastructure coordinator. And that person's going to manage budget, is going to work across various sectors of various departments, to kind of just be that primary point of contact upstream to help manage those flows. And then, of course, the final destination for a lot of these funds, cities and local governments, as well as metropolitan planning organizations to manage some of those regional planning issues. But again, high degree of recognition that this is going to take a lot of effort, a lot of coordination, and we're going to touch on in a minute where you can play a really pivotal role here. Last slide, I just wanted to show you before I turn it over to Liz. This is probably one of the most important slides in this slide deck for you. So you can go to this link here. We have it in our resources slide. But just in the last few weeks, a guidebook was released, Building a Better America. And what this book does is it gives you information on what to apply for, and this is for local officials, but it applies to you too, what to apply for, who to contact, and basically how to get ready. What are those key milestones and dates? The reason I put a picture of the table of contents is this document is really big, 470, 80 pages long. So what you're going to want to do is go to the table of contents, scan the table of contents, look at your project type that you are particularly interested in or your firm provides expertise in. When you click on that project type, it's going to take you to that page where you will have information on what those program funding streams are related to that project type, existing programs that have been enhanced, new programs that have been created. It'll give you an overview of the intention of the money to be used in the competitive grant arena, key dates, resources. So really great resource for you. And just know this is a living document. As more programs come online, more milestones come online, you'll want to check back on this. So it's not a static document. But with that, let me turn it over to Liz to kind of walk us through the timeline as of today.
Yeah, thanks, Yvonne. And that guidebook is where I got all of the information from this timeline that we're about to go through. I can't see how helpful it's going to be, and already is, in terms of understanding how things are going to be happening and how they'll be laid out. So as we know, the IIJA became law in 2021, and shortly thereafter, in December, the first round of formula grants went out to states and to large localities. Then that was followed again very quickly. Just last month, the RAISE grant applications opened up, and that's a competitive grant program. And there's later on this quarter, more grants are going to be opening up as well. I know for sure something called the State Incentives Pilot Program is going to be one of those. That's going to be followed again. More grants in Q2 will come online, some broadband ones. And then in Q3, in the next dot, in October of 2022, I wanted to note when the federal fiscal year restarts. So around October, you'll start to see everything kind of before this restart again. The next round of formula funding will go out, and formula funding is going to be divided over the 4 years that the IIJA covers, 5 years that it covers. So the next round of RAISE grant applications will then open up. So you'll see kind of all this stuff that we saw before open up again for the next year's round. Also in Q3 and Q4 of this year, more grant programs will come online. Just going through the guidebook, I was able to determine a lot of like energy related grants will open up, forest management, And then, so that kind of gives you the timeline. Like it's going to be sort of a slow leak, like how I talked about earlier with how this funding is going to be rolled out. And it'll just be on repeat year over year until fiscal October 2026, FY 2026 is the last year that this will cover. So after 2026, you know, who knows? There a lot could change between now and then. But this just gives you a broad timeline of how things are kind of going to be on this rolling basis for this funding.
And
then,
do you want to cover this? Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. And so these are some of the big themes. Again, that box on the right is where all that new funding breaks down. It's similar information to what we shared earlier with that time with the bar chart slide. But again, you can see how a lot of this is going to be roads and bridges. The RAISE grant program, for example, that just opened up, that's roads and bridges. But it's not, you know, there's a lot of design elements in that because the RAISE program covers public transit projects, preventing stormwater runoff, a new category called intermodal, and that's, you know, walking paths, cycling paths, that kind of thing. So there's a lot of stuff, you know, that's in that roads and bridges umbrella that's really about designing streets and that kind of stuff. And then obviously same deal for public transit. So there's just a lot of, you know, flexibility and creativity in terms of you know, these types of categories, these traditional categories. And then off to the left, I just wanted to highlight again that these are the big focuses of IIJA, serving equity, serving those who have been traditionally historically underserved, using technology and innovation in a way that achieves outcomes, the desired outcome, and then climate change, carbon reduction, environmentally friendly, anything under that category is highly prioritized. And again, this is just another way of showing you that there is about $1 trillion in total spending that's going to be happening over the next 4 years, excuse me. And a little over half of that is new spending. And this slide, I know you're all going to be able to download this, and so I'm not going to read every single word on here, but I couldn't figure out which one of these things to take off. So you can digest all of this later, but I just wanted to highlight some new programs in that $550 billion in new spending. And by new, that means, you know, we mean additional spending. These are programs that I think really kind of are ones that you want to pay attention to. That first one, Reconnecting Communities pilot program, I'm going to dive into a detail on the next slide. But just know that that's, again, you can see equity. It's aimed at reconnecting poorer neighborhoods to downtowns. It's about $1 billion in spending over the course of the next 4 or 5 years. Healthy Streets is another one that I thought was pretty interesting. It's essentially a $1 million grant, $100 million for 5 years, over the course of 5 years, for communities to install cool or porous pavements, or to plant trees. And again, it's getting at that, you know, climate and environment friendly type projects. There's an equity component in that it includes money for equity assessments for mapping tree canopy gaps. Essentially, you know, lower income neighborhoods tend not to have as much green space, and that can lead to all sorts of related health and economic and effects. Safe Streets and Roads for All, again, that's another biggie. It's $5 billion over the course of the next 5 years. It's preventing road fatalities, and it includes a significant amount for planning, design, and development. That is a grant program that opens, again, according to that guidebook, it opens in a couple of months in May of 22. And there's a lot of carbon reduction initiatives as well. In total, there's about $6.5 billion for programs that are aimed at reducing emissions. It also sets aside funding for construction, planning, and design of trail facilities for cyclists, walkers, you know, anyone on wheels, basically. It also includes funding for public transit and congestion management technologies.
And I love this
so,
example,
like I mentioned,
Liz. Yeah, sorry, go ahead. I just love this example. This is a really interesting project.
Yes, I love this. This is why I included it. So back when I was a reporter for a local paper in DC, like over a decade ago, they were talking about getting this project going, and it is now in the ending stages. So it's projects like these. This is an example of, okay, what would a reconnecting communities program project look like? So this is one that's existing. It's not, they're just about wrapping it up, but I included it because it's right here. I'm in Maryland, but right in DC, right in downtown. That map on the right shows you the portion of 395 that comes up from underground. But it is essentially a sunken tunnel on where it shows on the map. It creates this scar between Capitol Hill and the rest of the rest of downtown. And if you are in the DC area, if you've been around here for a while, you might recognize that area, particularly around Massachusetts Avenue, and then where 395 ends in New York Avenue. That section around North Capitol to the right of the 395 scar, it has been nobody's really paid attention to it in terms of a development perspective for a really long time. And it's because they stuck the highway there. It cut off that section of the city from the rest of the commerce off to the left of 395. And so, DC is just a development town now, so that isn't as true as it once was. But certainly the idea behind this project is to cover up that scar again. And so south of Massachusetts Avenue, where you see kind of the project activity there, like I said, it's a sunken tunnel right now, and they're just putting the roof back over that tunnel and then putting buildings and green space on top of it. And that's that image off to the left that gives you the cross section of the project. This is a huge, huge undertaking, obviously. And another reason I included this project was because you can see in that cross section how there's some, a lot of sustainability features, green roofs, other things that they're doing to make this not just a reconnecting project, but an environmentally friendlier project. And it's, again, adding something that had been taken away many years ago through bad decisions and bad urban planning. And just to give you a sense, again, this equity aspect, that's why I included that quote on the right. This is an op-ed from two urban planners and academics who were talking about this reconnecting communities program of, restoring or retrofitting highways that cut through downtowns. They call it a down payment on restorative justice. They note that these, kind of discriminatory policies that ended up, having cars run through these lower income neighborhoods created pollution and cut them off from transit. And so again, that's kind of shows you why why a program like this kind of touches on not just environment, but equity, as huge priorities for IIJA spending. However, the DC project alone cost about $1.3 billion, and that's more than the entire program in the Infrastructure and Jobs Act bill. It's $1 billion over 5 years. So that's why it's a down payment. They're still going to need a lot of private sector aid and investment to get something like this going. It's the Infrastructure and Jobs Act is meant to kind of help support something that is going to need a lot of other funding mechanisms and a lot of other partnerships to really be able to come to fruition.
Thanks, Liz. I'm going to go ahead and move on because I want to get to some of these slides on advice for our attendees. That was great information. Mm-hmm. Just, quick, I'm sharing this slide because we are seeing the advice being given to state and local leaders from the White House. They're saying and here's where the opportunity really is for you all. They're saying, okay, first of all, we recognize you may be short on staffing, but here's your to-do list or, to get started. First of all, prioritize your capital needs, develop project timelines, identify funding streams in that IIJA guidebook. Go to the guidebook, look at where those funding streams are, those competitive grant deadlines. Work with your metropolitan planning organizations for more regional planning. Map electric vehicle charging stations. Where do you want those things? Same thing with lead pipes. The money is here to replace lead pipes as well. Inventory and map those pipes that need to be replaced. Inventory and map broadband needs. This is huge for buildings, for smart buildings and for smart cities to enable that digital twin technology to be able to do more connective design with buildings and our infrastructure and utilities. Establishing relationships with regional offices of key federal agencies. So again, this is for state and local officials, but there's a piece here for you. They're telling state and local officials, you need to make connections with your regional federal offices. If you don't have those relationships, you need to start building those now. And don't forget about the ARPA funds. The ARPA funds are still there, a good chunk of it, to be used to help you rebuild your capacity, do some workforce training for some of the projects that are going to be coming online. And again, why this is important for you is now more than ever, these state and local offices need your expertise. They don't necessarily have the ability to connect. Some of them, more sophisticated, of course, have the ability, but there are so many local offices that don't have the capacity to manage and could use your expertise now. Think about all of those projects in the years past where you were working with a government or a nonprofit and you didn't have the funds to do it. You just couldn't do it at the level that you had envisioned. Guess what? Money's not an issue really at this point. Well, it is, it's always an issue, but it's not the main issue anymore. It's the capacity challenge, and how do we connect the dots to those funds to good valuable projects that are going to help the communities, and that's where you play such a critical role. So I just wanted you to know that this is what they're telling the state and local leaders, which means what an opportunity for you as a design firm to step in and help out. I wanted to move on. I know we only have 5 minutes, but please stick with us. This is really important. The Build Back Better Act. Okay, this is not passed. Obviously, just a little background. This was the act that in December stalled. You may remember that the Senate just couldn't get the votes to get the Build Back Better Act passed. The big holdup, what we were reading and hearing, was not necessarily the climate provisions in the bill, but the social spending pieces of the bill. So what we're reading and hearing is this actually may come back and maybe broken up into pieces so that the climate provisions can actually be addressed. And why that's important is, as we all know, climate mitigation resiliency has not been a priority over the last few decades. We are way behind on meeting our 2030 goals in greenhouse gas emission reductions. And what this bill does is it takes a slightly different approach from the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. It's $555 billion clean energy spending over the next 10 years. Some of the provisions that we saw in the latest version is things like tax credits to make it cheaper to install solar, wind, geothermal, battery technology. Things like incentives to keep existing low carbon nuclear power plants online, at least through the transition. Subsidies to consumers for electric vehicles, $12,500 per vehicle. Subsidies for heat pumps, the built environment, 40% of our emissions. Electrifying the built environment, using more energy efficient machines in our buildings or our homes. Heat pump subsidies to make it more affordable, supporting improvements to the power grid to manage those variabilities of more solar or more wind on our grid, advancing climate-friendly farming, better forest management, incentives for decarbonizing steel and cement. Of course, that's a play. But what I wanted to point out here, and the reason this is very different from the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, are these bullets here at the top. What the Build Back Better Act is focused on mature technologies right now. What do we have right now that we just need to deploy at massive scale to see some reductions in emissions quickly? And this is the last slide I really want you to focus in on. This was some energy modeling that was done by the REPEAT project. This was led by Princeton Zero Lab. So just to orient you on what you're seeing here on the screen, This is emissions right here on the left on the y-axis in metric tons, carbon dioxide equivalent emissions. Then we've got the timeline here, okay, 1990. So if we, and then here's the 2030 emissions goals that we need to be. These are those science-based emission targets to keep the Earth from warming above 1.5 degrees this century. For context, recall that we are at 1.1 degrees Celsius over the past century warming. So our carbon budget is pretty limited. We're already 1.1. We're trying to keep from going over 1.5, and that's what this 2030 goal is. So if you follow along with me here was our emissions in 1990. You can see it climbing to 2005, and now and then you see this roller coaster kind of deceleration of emissions. And then when you get to this point, here we are in 2022, right here. The trajectory for estimated emissions before the bipartisan infrastructure bill put us way above this 2030 goal. You can see that difference. Now that we have the bipartisan infrastructure bill, we've made some modest improvements, but this is where the Build Back Better Act actually gets us to that 2030 goal by steeply reducing emissions, because it is really focused on deploying clean energy technology now that we have, and just at a massive scale, getting adoption rates on electric vehicles. So you can see it makes a huge difference in our energy emissions profile. So in sum, it's impossible to reach our 2030 target without the Build Back Better Act. So we're just watching closely to see if that gets passed really soon, or hopefully in the spring. I'm going to turn this over to Liz. I know we're already over time, and I'm sorry. But if with us, there's other policy priorities. Liz, if you can go through these last couple of slides.
Yeah, I'll be really quick because y'all can read these later, and I want to be respectful of the time. But these are, the column on the left just kind of shows the array of different agencies and federal departments that Build Back Better, that the BBA will touch on in terms of the money that it sends. And so those are all the federal agencies that state and local governments could be interacting with to receive their funding. And on the right are just some examples of the categories of spending that are in the Build Back Better Act that will, most likely stay. As Yvonne mentioned, it's mostly the social stuff that is causing the hang up here. So a lot of focus on affordable housing, on climate mitigation projects. So you can go to the next slide. And so how might a local government implement programs within Build Back Better to get to these climate targets? I included Los Angeles here because it released its Green New Deal back in 2019, and it has these big lofty goals like Yvonne talked about. How do you reduce your climate impact? How do you reduce emissions? Los Angeles has a step-by-step process, and every year it reports its progress on those processes. So this is an example. This is a page pulled from its recent report, but you can see this list of very practical things it's doing, and deploying community air quality monitoring networks. Completed that. Looking at the bottom, tree canopies are coming up once again. It is making progress. Plant and maintain at least 90,000 trees citywide. Cool roofs and porous pavement. It's working on, has completed that task. So this just gives you a sense of, what exactly our government's going to be doing, on the ground to achieve these big climate goals. And so that's why I wanted to make sure and highlight this particular approach.
Thank you, Liz. All right, so we're going to wrap up just key takeaways. Just a quick historic opportunity truly for design firms. The time to engage is now. Don't assume that your state and local governments know what to need to do next. You guys are the connective tissue to help them get those funds. And then the first step, I would just say, scan the guidebook for the program funding streams that, are your firm's expertise. And then we have some resources here. Liz was kind enough to provide some links to some of the background information on what she's talked about if you want a deeper dive or more information. Here's the here's the guidebook that I referenced earlier. And lastly, at Victor, we thank you so much for being with us. For our policyholders or non-policyholders, just know we have a ton of other resources in addition to this webinar. If you don't know about this right here, you ought to, as a design firm, before you sign your contracts with your clients. We now have an artificial intelligence-backed tool that will help you review your contracts before you actually have to sign. It will spot what missing issues are in your contract, how to navigate the found issues in your contract, industry standards within those issues, and how to negotiate those provisions. It is a 2 to 3 minute extra spend for you to upload your contract into this tool. So highly recommend you take a look at it. We will create a custom website for you if you are interested. We have tons of courses, of course, that are all accredited by the AIA, along with a chunk of state licensing boards that have pre-approved our risk management courses. We have publications, and then also our blog. If you can subscribe to our blog, we try to keep it populated with new information, new posts at least every week, or at least every 2 weeks. So follow us there. And next month, we do have our webinar, Structuring Contract Language Holistically to Limit Risk, March 23rd. So please join us. The registration site is up. And with that, thank you, Liz, so much for joining us today. I really appreciate your insight and your time. It's a pleasure to work with you. That concludes today's program. Thank you for joining us, everyone. We hope you got some insight from this and you understand the critical role you have in this historic moment in time. Hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, Liz.
Bye, Yvonne. Thanks.